path in our study through the Old Testament. We're going to complete the book of Ezra today, and we're in chapter 10. Really, chapter 9 and 10 clearly work together when you read them kind of in context. And so let me just, if I could, recap a little bit of it and the things that Ezra found when he comes to Jerusalem. So being reminded of where we are actually in the text and the things that had taken place, if we remember from the time that they started to come back into the land under Zerubbabel, they have had people there. There have been things taking place around the temple, and they're back into the formal religion of doing what they're supposed to do as far as sacrifices, offerings, and all the rest of it. So when we pick up Ezra's time when he's coming into Jerusalem, it is my own personal belief that I don't think he expects to find what he does when he gets there, and I don't think it's all that obvious when he first arrives. It's a few days in. But what he finds, and this is what we get mainly in chapter 9, is the people who had been there, it didn't take them long to get settled into the land, and we can see clearly that they became complacent. And in that being complacent, they began to violate the law almost immediately. And in this case, the way that they violated that law was to begin to intermingle with the people of the land. And it's not just having some kind of commercial, dealings with the people in the land. That's not the problem. The problem was that the people of the people who had returned from their exile, from their enslavement and their captivity to Babylon and then ultimately to Persia, when they get back into their own land, they start to repeat the same exact things, and there's intermarriage that begins to happen with pagan people from the area. And in some cases, it tells us that they had had children as well. So when Ezra hears of it, it's not just the people of the land, it's all the way to the priests and the Levites. And so when he hears this, he's so distraught. There's just this immediate mourning and breaking of his heart and his mind. And actually what he ends up seeing, or what we end up seeing in his actions, was he realizes the actual peril that his entire nation is in. And so in chapter 10, we pick up with him still in that place of mourning, and really kind of, it tells us he's weeping and confessing these things before the Lord. I think that there's a couple of things going on here. There's got to be the clear understanding that the Lord is not going to look the other way on this. And similar to what we saw kind of with Josiah when he first came to an understanding of what had taken place, and even as he grew older and they found the book of the law, they realized how out of control what they were doing was, and how seemingly there must have been so much of what they were doing, though they thought they were doing right. Josiah was a good king, obviously, but when they found the book of the law and were able to look at all of the details of what was taking place there, they realized that what they were doing was not in line. It wasn't in keeping with the law. And the immediate reaction of Josiah, if you go back and read it, was to say, my paraphrase, you could see it in his actions, is that we have a problem here. And what we're doing is an open provocation to God because we're not doing in accordance with his word. And it was immediate, and he was terrified by it. So they implemented at that point. They implemented immediate action to make sure that what was going on in the temple was done according to the way it should be, that the offerings were as they should be, that the people's compliance with being obedient to the law was in place. And we have very much the same situation here. But I want to make sure that we pay attention to this because it is, I think, pretty interesting and pretty important to recognize. They hadn't been there that long. I mean, it's not like it'd been a year or so, but it's basically from the time of Zerubbabel, it's only a couple of generations that it's gotten to this point where they are so settled in their religion, seemingly living at ease because they're back in the land and they're just kind of not paying attention to things anymore. They begin to, as a pattern, as a lifestyle, as a people, they're beginning to infringe on all of what God said not to do. So going back in their history, it doesn't take very long to find that what God had said initially was don't have any interaction with them in the way of marriage, children, anything else. Don't let them in. They'll just be a corrupting influence to you. Now, one thing, and it'll come up in here because, again, all it can be is kind of a question that we would have to ask. But what does it say of the person that is not Jewish but sees what's going on and desires it for themselves? Could a stranger, somebody who is not Jewish, come into the fold, if you will? And we get that clearly through their history that, yeah, that's possible, but it means basically they have to leave everything behind that they believed and what they were about, and they had to become people who were completely obedient to the law of God. Not to the law of the people necessarily, but one would lead to the other. But they had to find themselves in a place of obedience to the Lord himself through his written word and being people who were under the law. So it's not at all a problem per se that there may be people who were not Jewish who could live among them and be one of them in the sense of proselytizing in and being children of God based upon his word and based upon his law. So that's something to be reminded of in the background of this. And it's very much a New Testament understanding as well, that when we come to faith and relationship with God through his son Jesus, it is that we are to abandon everything that was about our old life and what we believed. The things that were important to us are supposed to be, as we are revealed by the word, what God's priorities are supposed to become ours. So easy to forget, but it is nonetheless important and true. It's the same in the New Testament as it is in the Old. If people want to come into a relationship with God, he has his standards and things that he requires of us. And but people are free to come and to be a part of what he is doing. And so that's something that is here in the background. The only reason that we would have for such an incident to become such a problem was the people that they had married had not come into faith. So there would be no reason for this reaction, because we keep hearing that they are the pagan wives. There's paganism that is known of them. So there's this mixing and this, if you will, compromise taking place at the highest of the levels. So from the what we would consider as the nobles or the leaders, including and all the way up to the Levites and the priests. So whenever you hear priests and Levites, just in case I haven't made it clear, if it's not clear to you, if you're kind of new to studying through the Old Testament, whenever you hear Levites, you just know that these are all the descendants of one of the sons of Jacob, Levi. So the tribe of Levi is anybody who is from his descendants. Those are all those people. The priests are a line within that tribe, and they come through the person Aaron, Moses' brother. We get him at Exodus. So the people that could serve as priests would have to be direct descendants of Aaron, though they are part of the larger tribe of Levi, and all of the Levites are supposed to be serving in some sense. And I want to go to something in this because I think it's really, really important. And it goes all the way back to the book of Numbers and just a couple of verses that I want to go through. And so it's an important thing that they are to remember, that of each of the allotments. In fact, let's go ahead and do it. Let's go to Numbers chapter 18. And I want to look at one verse, or a couple of verses rather, that are something that we should be keeping in mind, especially as we go through the history of Israel. What should have been being done was that these people should have been being obedient to God all along. And clearly they were not. Clearly they were in a place of rebellion when I think of the priests and the Levites. And here's a good example of it. So in the big picture, the children of Israel, when they would come into the land from Joshua's time on, there would be represented these tribes. Now, by this time, one of the sons of Jacob was Joseph, but you'll never find the tribe of Joseph in any of the writings. Instead, because of all of what had taken place, God gives him what would be considered as a double portion, and his two sons would end up being of those tribes. So Ephraim and Manasseh were not sons of Jacob, they were sons of Joseph. So they are considered as to being those tribes. So it takes it from being the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Jacob, the sons. In this case, because one of the sons of Jacob was Joseph, he has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So that takes it from 12 to 13. So the 12 tribes, and Manasseh and Ephraim are part of it, had land allotments. The whole tribe was to live here. In a couple of cases they were split up, or in one case they were split. Manasseh was split into two parts. And so there was a part that was in Israel proper. There was a part that was in the area around and through Syria and Jordan, modern day. And so that was the Manasseh that was east of the Jordan River. But what of the Levites? Because they weren't given an allotment of land. And I love how this is put, because it's such an amazing thing when you stop to think about it. If God was going to be giving something as an inheritance or as a portion, in this case it would be the land, each one of the tribes was given, they were able to go and settle a particular part of land that was for them to inhabit and to govern and to see to the well-being of it. But interspersed through all of the tribes were the Levites, who would be the ones that would minister to the people. That was their full-time thing. And here's how God says it to them. So the Lord said to Aaron, so speaking to Aaron all the way at the beginning of this, of the tribal allotments and who was going to get what place and where and all the rest of it, the Levites were a completely different group of people. Because it says here, then the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, nor shall you have any portion among them. And then God says, I am your portion and your inheritance among the children of Israel. Behold, I have given the children of Levi all of the tithes of Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting. And that's a pretty amazing statement when you stop to think about it, because God says, I'm giving land to everyone else. That's what's their inheritance. It's what I'm giving to them. It's their portion. It's my gift to them. So here God would say, but to you, Aaron, and to your descendants, and to the rest of the tribe of Levi, I'm going to give myself to you as your inheritance. And this is especially true of the priesthood, because the Levites could live in the general area and they could have things that they would see to, some amount of things. But as far as the priests, the descendants of Aaron, completely different story. Theirs was to full-time to minister to the Lord. And the Levites were given to them as people who would assist in all of these, but the priests were the only ones who could do the offerings and all of that. So all of that being said, and why I bring it up, even with that wonderful inheritance that God had given to them, they had yet, all the way up to the priesthood and the Levites, had begun to disobey and rebel against God by taking these wives that they never should have had. So that brings us to Ezra chapter 10. Chapter 9, again, is that place where Ezra realizes the gravity of what's taken place, and there is just weeping and mourning and brokenness in him. And so we're going to see what happens as a result of it. The people are visibly able to see that this man who is so righteous in their midst, Ezra, when he sees the condition of things and what they had done, they see his brokenness. They see, and some of them must have really realized, if it's affecting Ezra this way, we should really take an inventory of this, because if he's got a problem with it, then clearly God does too. And by his reaction to it, it's just not one of those things where he says, this really is something that you shouldn't do. He's actually in a place of mourning. He has torn his clothes, sackcloth and ashes, and grief and mourning and crying out to God. To them, they should look at that and say it's either an overreaction or he understands just the gravity of this. Clearly it was the latter. So, chapter 10, verse 1, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we pray that you would give us understanding in your word, and that as we come to you and as we study your word, may we learn the importance of what it is to walk honorably and rightly before you. And as we find this historical account, there is much that we can take from it in the way of application as well. The seriousness of following after your word and being in a place of obedience before you. At the top of all of those lists, this is what we learn. And may we learn those as well, and may it help us in our recognition of our own lives and our need for obedience to you. We give you thanks, and we pray that you would help us as we study through your written word, not only in the Old Testament sense, but in the New as well. Whenever we come to you, may we recognize that what we read, no matter where it is the account of what it is to walk rightly and honorably. So may we be obedient, and we ask all this in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 10 says, now, while Ezra was praying, and while he was confessing, weeping, and bowing down before the house of God, a very large assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him from Israel, for the people wept very bitterly. So yeah, now they're seeing it. The very same people that were just kind of going along with it seeing Ezra's reaction to the whole thing brings to them an understanding of, he's right. There's an issue that's going on here. Now, it would appear as though the ones who have come to him are not the ones that are in the place of offense, because they're looking for remedy. They recognize that what Ezra is doing is coming before the Lord and seeing what can be done about the situation. And based on his reaction, I'm pretty convinced that he realizes that they are really ripe for judgment. God has brought them back into the land after the last time that they were displaced from the land because of disobedience. And here they are, from top to bottom, all the way up to the leaders and the priests, are doing the exact same kind of things that provoked God in the first place. So clearly Ezra would have a real problem with this, thinking, are we going to have to go back into captivity? Is God going to judge us again? So they must have seen this in Ezra, and there is a repeating of it. Now, the only other option is that they were already distraught with this before, and they were already troubled. Entirely possible. And they see a person like Ezra who can be that kind of rallying point and the person with the authority to do something about it. So both could be true, could be elements of both. Maybe people just kind of wised up and came to their senses because they saw Ezra. I am sure that there had to have been people there that were very, very troubled by all of this. I can't imagine that every single person there was complicit in this. But what could be done about it? Well, now you've got a guy in Ezra who has a great deal of not only authority from Persia, but this is a man who commands that kind of respect anyway. So here he is, he's crying out, people come to him, and they all wept bitterly too because they saw the trouble that is here. So then Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, spoke up and said to Ezra, we have trespassed against our God, and we have taken pagan wives from the peoples of the land, yet there is hope in Israel in spite of all of this. So when we is used here, there's no impression that we get that he says we in the sense like the people standing before Ezra are also culpable. He's talking about in the sense of Israel. We as a people here, reestablished in the land, have trespassed against God. We've done exactly the things that he says we are never to do. All the way back in the law, when they're still walking through the wilderness before ever even coming into the land, God had said, have nothing to do with the foreign nations. Have nothing to do with intermarriage. Have nothing to do with allowing them into your midst, because they will be a corrupting influence. So this part here is that there is still hope in Israel in spite of what we've done or what has been done. And that hopefulness is that God hears and God forgives if there's a repentant heart, and if there is also a wholesale change that happens among the people. That's the remedy. That's the prescription. Now, verse 3, therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all those wives and those who have been born to them, according to the advice of my master, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. And so let the law be what governs. So people's personal opinions, their sensibilities, whatever it may be, whether they really love their wives and kids and all the rest of that, none of that is relevant here. It is something needs to be done to curb what is going to be coming very soon, and that's God's judgment, because we have trespassed against him and him only. Now, some read this and they think this is incredibly heartless. And so why would they allow something like this? Why would they even think to split up families and all the rest of it? And they'll take that even a step further and really point the finger at God. What kind of a God would make them do something like that? Well, it's important to say, why are you blaming God for something that they had done? So the idea that God wouldn't have wanted this done in the first place, it's not as though they could plead ignorance in this matter. And that's hugely important. So here's the point. When does it get to the point where you say, we have to stop this? If it's not done now, when will it be done? And of course, there's a lot of other questions. And really, the passage doesn't tell us, and I had mentioned it a little bit earlier, that if a person of their own free will wanted to come and to be a part of what God was doing, think Ruth and Boaz and all of that, and Naomi, that Ruth was not of the children of Israel, but she has a very prominent part even in the genealogy of Jesus. So clearly she left that to be a part of what, if you remember what she had said to Naomi, that your God will be my God, your people will be my people. So she was willing to live in accordance with everything that God had desired, because God would welcome anybody who comes to him on his terms. So could it be that some of these people may very well have been able to remain? They wouldn't have been able to at that point be married, because that was not something that was supposed to happen. But could these people become a part of the nation? That's possible. And same thing with the kids and all the rest. And then there's also the other question about, well, what happened with the kids? Did they have to go with the mothers, or were they able to stay with their fathers? And so, again, accordance with the law, and really even from precedent, think about what happened with Hagar and Ishmael when she was put out. That was never supposed to be the case. Then they took it upon themselves, and then it was Sarah who had the change of heart. She's the one who came up with the idea in the first place. But Hagar was taken out with Ishmael, and so the child stayed with the mother. Is it the same case here? We don't have any details. It just doesn't, frankly, it doesn't tell us. So again, from the little bits and pieces that we can put together, the one thing that we know is that as far as the union, or what we would call the marriage, or that they had taken these wives, not recognized by God. As far as God was concerned, there was no marriage. And so as far as that union, it was to be broken and cast off. And there was going to be a forced kind of a thing, or they were to be just removed from being part of the nation. If they wanted to go with their wives, if they wanted to go with their children, they were going to be basically dismissing any of their rights to anything among the children of Israel. It's a big matter. So again, a lot of questions that are open. Let me run through them again. What happens with the wives and the children? Again, the marriages are going to be annulled or removed or changed. There's just nothing left there. What becomes of the moms? What becomes of the kids? A lot of that depends on whether or not the mothers, or depending on the age of the kids, if they want to be people who would live under everything that the law had prescribed for them, then that was supposed to be something that they were free to do. Again, God's not going to cast off anyone who comes with him or comes to him. What happens with marriage down the road? Again, all of that is just hypothetical. It's not even dealt with in this text. Even what I'm saying is just, what would happen in that kind of a case? Well, the things that we do know, God could accept them in, but he will not accept the marriages. That had to come to an end. And so, again, it's a grievous situation. Sure, it never should have been happening in the first place. None of this was possible. It's only a result of sin and willfulness. And so the misery that came from it is because of man's disobedience. Sound familiar? So here we have in verse 4, arise, for this matter is your responsibility. We are also with you. Be of courage and see that it's done, or to do it. Let's look at verse 3 one more time. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away these wives and those who have been born to them, according to the advice of my master, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God. Let it be done in accordance with the law. Let that be the standard. So, to you, Ezra, you're this person who has this authority, not only from the Persians, to see that the law was implemented, and you have all the power to do this. This is a matter for you to deal with, but we'll back you. That's what verse 4 is talking about. We will also be with you. We will encourage you, and so be of good courage and see to it, or have these things done. Do this. Now, verse 5. So Ezra arose, made the leaders of the priests and the Levites, and then all of Israel, swear an oath that they would do in accordance to the word, and so they all swore this oath. Now, this idea of swearing an oath, we will do exactly what we're being told to do. Those who are in the place of offense, those who have married foreign wives that have nothing to do with Israel, they are to be put away. They all took the oath. We know this. An oath is only as good as what's being said, and you can give an oath and not follow through with it. They're going to put a following through clause in this, and it's going to be something that they will have to prove that they have done so. So we get in verse 6, so Ezra rose up from before the house of God, went into the chamber of Jehohanan, the son of Elishib, and when he had come there, he ate no bread, drank no water, for he mourned because of the guilt of those from the captivity. So, let's just read on. So they issued a proclamation throughout all of Judah and Jerusalem to all of the descendants of the captivity that they must gather at Jerusalem. So this becomes an official matter for the priests, the Levites. This is, the going to the chambers means that this person, there's a lot of disagreement on this, of whether or not this is spoken of a chamber that would be ultimately down the road, because this person that seems to be mentioned here is kind of a contemporary with Nehemiah, but we're not given his age for sure. Or is he very early on in that priestly kind of lifetime? And it's just very, very, very early on. There's a lot of disagreement about it. It really doesn't change anything, because what's important is that from the leadership of the priesthood on down, and with Ezra kind of pushing this whole thing, it was going to have the force of the priests and the Levites going to the entirety of the nation and calling all to assemble to them at Jerusalem to make this known. This is what's going to take place. This is not a negotiation. It's not something that's up for debate. There's not going to be any discussion about any of this. You're just being told you must come, because you're going to be made responsible for it if you're guilty. And anyone who is not going to be a part of this or refuses to do it, there is going to be consequence to it. So again, verse 7. They issued this proclamation throughout all of Judah and Jerusalem, so the whole surrounding area, to all the descendants of the captivity, that they must gather at Jerusalem, and whoever would not come within 3 days, so obviously you're going to have to make haste, stop everything that you're doing and get here. So they had to do it according to the instructions of the leaders and the elders. All their property, if they did not, all of their property would be confiscated, and he himself would be separated from the assembly of those from the captivity. So what this tells us is that people that wouldn't go there in the first place are going to have everything about their inheritance taken from them. Everything that belonged to them would be taken, and they would be cut off. They would not be considered as a part of the congregation any longer. And my guess is anybody who may have come to it and heard the proclamation and still disagreed with it, it would be the same thing, because they're going to find out to a man how many of these people actually did what was the problem, married foreign wives. And there's only one way we can look at this. They must have, the wives at minimum, must have continued in their paganism, and it was being allowed to be done under the roof of their household, and their husband was responsible for this. If he was involved in it, then there would have to be a complete repentance and cleansing from it. And of course, the wife, if they're going to continue on in that, are going to be removed. And so that's just the way it's going to be. So, verse 9, so all the men of Judah and of Benjamin, which tells you it's including the surrounding area of Benjamin. These were the two tribes that comprised what we consider Judah before the fall and before going and being taken into their captivity to Babylon. And real quickly, does that mean that there are only people of the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah that are living here at this time, that are part of that group that came back? Not necessarily. Well, certainly not. Because even during the time when you had the people under, let's say, Josiah, when Josiah it's really the only kingdom that's left, Judah being there around Jerusalem. But it tells us that Josiah would go up into the old parts of what was the northern tribes, long since defeated and carried away by the Assyrians and now intermingled with all of them. Still there were people from all of those other tribes that had either come to Jerusalem, or they were still living in their land but wanting to do in accordance with with their laws best they could. So there are other tribes clearly that would be represented here. So that's just, it's kind of a given. Verse 9, all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered together at Jerusalem within those 3 days, and it was the 9th month of the 12th, on the 12th of that month, and all the people sat in the open square in the house of God, trembling because of the matter and because of heavy rain. This is, in their 9th month, is the equivalent to our December. And I lived in California up until just 2.5 years ago, and that my whole life had been there. And so what I know is that oftentimes the weather in Israel is very similar to what it is there in that part of California. Higher elevations get a little colder. Jerusalem is higher elevation. But be that as it may, if you're there in December and it's raining, there is the trembling that is of fear. There's also the trembling that the weather is very inclement at that time, seemingly. At very minimum rains, but cooler temperatures if it's December too. So they realized now that this has all come to our knowledge, you're not going to get everybody there that's been assembled. Who knows the volumes of it? It could be a lot of people by this time. It could be in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands by this time. And so I'm sure it is, actually, come to think of it, because they've had that time since Zerubbabel, 70 years plus. So with all that said, there are just frankly too many people to have this handled right on the spot. So they're going to come up with a solution. What do we do about this to make sure that the people make good on their oath? It's a very important matter, but like I say, it's pretty rough weather at the time. So we read in verse 9, Ezra the priest stood up, said to them, "You have transgressed, and you have taken pagan wives, adding to the guilt of all of Israel." So this is what he ends up saying to them. This is something that they know. He continues with that. "Now therefore, make confession to the Lord of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourself from the peoples of the land and from the pagan wives." That was the proclamation. That was, well, why have you gathered everyone here? Because this is what's going to take place. All of you who are in that place of offense, this is what's going to need to be done. So he puts it out there in kind of no uncertain terms. It's very obvious what they're going to be required to do, because he says it very, very specifically with straight detail. So I know that I kind of jumped from verses 9 to 10 quickly. Let's just do this all in its context. Verse 9. "All the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered at Jerusalem within 3 days." Period. That's the first part. That's what went out. Get here within 3 days. They show up. It was the ninth month, so it's basically December. They sat in the area around the temple where they could all gather, and it says they trembled. They knew that something serious was taking place, and the weather was inclement. So it may very well be that there's the physical trembling out of fear and the physical trembling out of exposure. "Ezra, the high priest, stood up and said to them, 'You have transgressed, and you have taken pagan wives, adding to the guilt of Israel.'" Like there's other things going on here too, but that's the big one here that we are here to address. "So therefore," verse 11, "make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers, to do his will." Part one. This idea to own up to what you've done and confess it before the Lord, because you're going to need to seek his remedy in this. And though you could go ahead and tell your wife and whatever, if you have kids, you can't be here any longer, that still doesn't deal with their culpability and their guilt in the matter. That's going to be the consequence. The separation is the consequence. The cause and the problem of it is their willfulness, disobedience, and their sin against God and against his law. So you need to confess before you do all the rest of the stuff. You have to own what you've done. "So, therefore, make confession to the Lord God of your fathers and do his will." So there's not only this is the repentance, the correction. Now you know what you've done wrong. Now you need to be in a place of obedience, which is a matter of the heart and the mind, but it's going to lead to action. And that action is the putting away. So he says this: "Separate yourselves from the peoples of this land and from pagan wives." So it's not even to have any kind of interaction with the people, because the same corruption would take place. It's a different kind of relationship. It's commercial, it's with the people. And if you're having it in the sense of with wives, it's taken it that step further, but they're not to have any interaction. Why? God knows the corrupting influence. He knows that it will get in the way. How do we know that? Look at what's already taken place. So, verse 12. "So all the assembly answered, and they said with a loud voice, 'Yes, as you have said, so we must do.'" Not just that we will, but we must. This is a necessity. Now, we know human nature. It's easy to be stirred up in the moment, especially when you think that you're going to be held accountable if you do not do what you're supposed to. So it would be one thing for them to say, "Yes, we'll do it," but how do you know that they will? Are they saying it in the heat of the moment? Are they saying it because all eyes are on them? What happens when they go back to their place and nobody's paying attention? Will they follow through with it? So it's one thing for them to say, "We must do this." It's a thing that should be agreed to. Yes, you must, and we're going to be sure that you do. And really, why is this, this, again, human nature is to say, well, it's not right that they would have somebody looking over their shoulder to make sure that they do it. Let's remember that the nation itself would rise and fall based upon what was happening around them. So yeah, I'm going to want to make sure that these people who say this, if I'm one of the people who is not offended in this, I want to see the people who have offended in it. I want to see that they do exactly what they said that they would, because God's wrath will be upon them if it's not done. So yeah, I have a stake in this, even though I'm not, I'm not part of the violators of what's been done here. It's going to affect me. It's going to affect my family, because God's judgment would come if this doesn't get corrected. So there's an investment that all people should have in this. And let that be an interesting little sideline type of thing when it comes to matters in the church. And boy, if this was being done and this kind of care and concern was being done in the church, we wouldn't have the room for all of the compromise and the horrible doctrine and the pretty much just the ignorance of what God would have for the church to do. They just assemble in buildings because they've always assembled in buildings, and their denominations meet because their denominations have always met. But it doesn't mean that they're walking as they're supposed to. Well, if they would be able to look at something like this and say, let's put aside anything that might hurt our own sensibilities and let's just be honest and self-assessing, yeah, this would change the church. And again, this is their covenant. But boy, the things you could learn from that covenant, because we are also a covenant, the church is supposed to be a covenant. Yeah, we ought to take a look at the things that God says don't do, and if the church is doing them, this should be the same kind of reaction. So, they answered yes, this is what we must do. Verse 13 said, now, here's the problem though. This represents a little bit of an issue because there's so many of them. Look at verse 13. But there are many people. It is the season for heavy rain, and we are not able to stand outside. We can't wait our turn because there's just too many people, and it's going to take a while to get this all sorted out, and it's just not good for us to be here at Jerusalem while all of this gets kind of adjudicated. So they bring up there's a couple of ways people could look at this. They're doing this because they want to just get out of town. Okay, there may be a reason for wanting to do that. Maybe it's just self-preservation. But needless to say, it needs to be done, but it can't be done while we're all just sitting here. It doesn't seem to be any kind of an excuse about let's just get out of here. There's just too many people. We can't do it all right now. Let's just get to it later. That's not what's being done here, because you'll notice what they do right away. So there are too many people, or there are so many people. It is the season for heavy rain, and we are not able to stand outside. Nor is this the work of 1 or 2 days, because there are many of us who have transgressed in this matter. So yeah, this becomes a problem. We've identified it, but there's no quick fix to this because the people are so numerous. And we've got to make sure that they not just take an oath, but that they follow through with it, or else we've really done nothing here. So what's going to be done? Verse 14, please let the leaders of our entire assembly stand, and let all those in our cities who have taken wives come at appointed times together with the elders and the judges of their cities, until the fierce wrath of our God is turned away from us in this matter. And only Jonathan, the son of Ashael, and Jehaziah, the son of Tikvah, opposed this. So they were given support from the rest of the people. Now, it may very well be that it doesn't tell us why there was opposition to it. You may have had people that said, I don't care how long it takes, we should do it while it's here. Or is it they don't want to have to go through with this? My guess is that it's probably the former, because the latter would mean that they're cut off from the nation. I don't think that's what they necessarily wanted to, but their objection is not really told to us in any kind of detail. But anyhow, no matter what it is, the idea is, let's have everybody go back home. Let's have the leaders and those groups in the cities and the ones who would know who is in their midst who have done this. Let's let them get it figured out, and then let everybody come at an appointed time. And the leaders of that city, the people who are making sure that there is accountability, would accompany those who are going to have it heard. Did you marry foreign wives? Have you put them away? What have you done if there's children involved? All of what was supposed to be done was going to be seen to a man, city by city, that it was done the way that it was supposed to be, because everybody knew everybody else. So this seems agreeable, at least enough to enough of the people. So in verse 16 we see this. So the descendants of the captivity did so. Ezra the priest, with certain heads of the fathers' houses, were set apart by the fathers' households, each of them by name, and they sat down on the first day of the 10th month to examine the matter. And by the first day of the first month, they had finished. So a couple of months is what it took for them to get through all this. And that just gives you an idea. It took that long, day by day, to hear each one of the cases, to verify that they had taken the oath and then followed through with it. What's happened with the wives, what's happened with the kids, what's been done with all of that. And so this group of men were meeting to hear it case by case, a number of the men. So it was just really, if you think about this, this is like assembling a grand jury in our modern times. And these would be men that were considered to be men of integrity. Ezra right up at the top of that list. And they heard it case by case by case, and it took them 2 months to get through it. That's a pretty big deal when you stop to think about it. How long does it take to figure out, especially since you have the people that would attest to it, that could say, okay, you were one who was responsible for this? Yes. Your wife's name and whatever, what's been done with her, they'd be able to give an account, and then the people who came with them would be able to attest and say, yes, it's true. Doesn't seem like it would be terribly complicated to get to the bottom of this and make sure that it's been followed through very quickly. But still, it took 2 months. I think that speaks more, not about how deliberative it was, because it's not difficult. It just tells me it's more the volume of how much of this has been taking place. But again, it's silent in the text, so we don't want to do anything more than just say that here's the possibilities. So, verse 18. And among the sons of the priests who had taken pagan wives, the following were found of the sons of Jeshua. Now, the reason why this is important, and again, we have this when it comes to a lot of these places where a lot of names are given. And so when you see an accounting of the names, you're going to find the groups of people that this is part of. It's not just necessarily the people of who's been there, but they start to mention the names of some very prominent people, and it's to keep an actual record. Is this the exhaustive list? Probably not, as you'll see here, because there's others that are mentioned of just larger groups. So this would be that way of written record, and if it's something that's written and published, then they don't have the ability to go back to it after all the dust settles. This is a forever kept record type of a thing, and yeah, it should be followed up on. That it's not just one of those things where one of these people could say to their wife, just go away for a few days, let's make it look as though the whole thing's broken, but you can make your way back. It's not going to be that kind of a case. And it would be something that the generations after would have to just make sure we're going to be careful not to see this repeated. So they gave their promise that they would put away their wives, and being guilty, they presented a ram of the flock for their trespass offering. So looking at the trespasses between man and God, and man would have to offer. This is in accordance with the offerings that you find. You can see them listed in Leviticus. If you want to go back and look at each of the types of offerings, there's lots of those resources, easy to find online. Just look at the offerings of Israel, and it'll tell you for each one why, what was it supposed to be, what parts were consumed, was it completely consumed. You can get all of that detail. So we find that there's you'll see this place, the sons of, and so it gives you kind of a breakdown of the names. So it tells us the sons of Emer, and then it gives those names. But notice right there in verse 23 that the first group is priests. The next group is the Levites, and of the Levites you have these names of the people that are there, also of the singers. So people that were the ones that were doing the worship, the singers, as David had prescribed. It was supposed to be done pretty much in the very same way. It was one of the things that Ezra was going to make sure took place. Some of the singers came with him, but these are ones that must have already been there clearly, because this is what they found once they got there. The people that were coming with Ezra were just going to be added to the numbers of who was already there. But you have the people that are there in the sense of the Levites that served in the temple, the priests who were supposed to be doing the offerings, yet they're among the transgressors. It just gives you an idea of how big of a problem this is, that even the people, let's do it this way. Let's think about it in the church. What's the equivalent to the priests, the Levites, and the singers? Imagine a church that God has said what is acceptable and not acceptable as far as husband and wife relationships. So, in this case, something that would fall outside of biblical morality, imagine if you had it with the pastor, with the elders, and with the worship people. All of them are in this place of sin before God. It should have been known because it was in writing, but it's being ignored, covered up, and participated in by all of the leadership and all of these people that are they have official functions. That gives you an idea just how messed up this had become. So there was the singers and also of the gatekeepers. And so those are the people that just make sure that everything is functioning as it should around the temple. What this helps us to understand is that this is across the board, all the people who are supposed to be serving in some capacity there in the temple. And before this, it doesn't even get to the people yet. You just realize this is from a top-down kind of a way of looking at the names and the people, and instructive to us. If it starts at the top and works its way down, again, let that be a lesson that what happens with the people under, if they see compromise at the top, it makes compromise below them that much easier to do. It's why we should never wink and nod at sin. It should be taken seriously. So, and the others of Israel, of the sons of Perosh. And so that gives those names. And so these are like heads of the families. We get to, it just kind of goes all the way down until we get to basically it's the end of the passage. You have all of those names that are there. Again, many of them are not even known to us. So let me make mention of one thing before we look at the last verse. When you see names like this mentioned, they're mentioned for their records. It is a way of recognizing the place and the problem within the people of Israel. And it is kept as a record, again, in this place we've already seen. The importance is to recognize who it was that was the offender so that they couldn't stay in their offense. And yeah, there's probably a deterrent to this as well. If you're going to basically have your sin broadcast for everyone, you would hope that it would have kind of a deterrent effect. But no matter how it is, this is a written record. Written records are very, very important to Israel, and it is a way of, in some cases, a very good thing because it establishes who is in the land and who is a part of the family and who has the rights of that. In this case, also in the sense of the offense. And yeah, it should be known that this was from the highest levels, a type of corruption that had really permeated all of the nation, to the point where when Ezra saw it, you could see by his reaction, it's not just, I'm upset, you shouldn't be doing this, but it's not a big deal. He just realizes, again, the gravity of it. And some of the people there as well, whether by his recommendation, or by watching his reaction, or if they had it all along and now found someone who could be of like mind, who could do something about it. So however we get that, we don't know for sure. Again, the text doesn't really tell us. And so we get in this in verse 44. So all these people, all of them had taken pagan wives. Some of them had wives by whom they also had children. So I've already kind of addressed it, but what becomes of them? What happens with the children? Do they follow the mom? There are those who would say, yeah, they did. Others would say, no, they could very well have stayed with their fathers and been brought up in the correct understanding of the faith because they were their children as well. So, when I looked at it a little bit earlier with Hagar and Ishmael, why was Ishmael not allowed to stay with Abraham? Because he was not the son of the promise. God promised he would take care of Ishmael and take care of Hagar, but they were not to be a part. And so in this case, the wives would not be a part of a marriage. The children potentially could have stayed either with father or mother. We're not told. And so, again, it only calls for speculation. I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer to this. But the importance of this, what had been taking place, and the relationship that they had with these people, it was to come to an end, period. There was just nothing to debate here anymore. This was the end of it. And so it ends very abruptly. You're thinking, okay, where's chapter 11? Because that's just the way that the whole book ends. Yeah, that's pretty much where the book ends. Now, we move to Nehemiah next week. And Nehemiah is going to see to the necessity of building a security of the place, not only for the temple, but for the whole city. and that's the rebuilding of the walls. Now, at this time, everything that we've read as far as Ezra is concerned, Nehemiah is still back. The things that were being done during Zerubbabel and in Ezra's time, Nehemiah is still back in Babylon at the time, and still under Artaxerxes and the Medo-Persians, and he's going to be coming back. And yeah, this was done in waves. So we'll pick up with him next week in chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah, and we'll continue on because it is kind of a chronological breakdown of these historical books, and it tells us what's going on. So remember, this is the time when you would have, as far as the prophets. It's going to be in this time where you get to Zechariah, and then ultimately you get into Malachi as well. And by the time Malachi rolls around, there's a problem even with all of these reforms that take place under Ezra and then Nehemiah. There's going to be a problem also by the time Malachi becomes the prophet writing to the priesthood, basically a little bit more than a generation after Nehemiah completes his work. You have, once again, the priests become completely in a place of corruption. It just shows you how fast it can happen if you take your eye off of your objective. And they clearly did that repeatedly over and over again. But we'll get that next week when we start in the book of Nehemiah. For now, we will just kind of conclude with Ezra where it is, and pick up there next week. So with all of that, we have a couple of things real quick. The trip going to Israel. If you're interested, we have a trip that is set up for next year, which is March of 2023. And if you're interested in it, then you can contact us through the ministry's website. That is oldpaththeology.net. And we also have a newsletter. We just sent out a copy of it, and we've had some people who have signed up for it since then. We'll get you in on the next one. But you can also, again, contact us if you'd like to get that. We'll be putting out information like Israel, or if there are things in the news, or if there are just things that are going on that should be addressed. There's a whole variety of different things that we'll put in the email list. So contact us for the newsletter if you'd like to, and have it signed up. If you're watching us on YouTube, we ask that you be a subscriber, and then that way it will let you know as we're putting up content. We do so twice a week, and then on occasion, depending on time and topics, we'll do topical things too, in addition to our Through the Bible studies. So we appreciate any feedback. If you have any questions about anything that's been shared here, then contact us through the email. We love to correspond with you and answer any questions if you have them. So with that, we pick up at Nehemiah next week, and look forward to having you with us.